In today's episode, we're diving into a topic that's not often talked about: how ADHD and hormonal shifts during perimenopause intersect, and why understanding this connection is a game changer for women. I'm joined by the incredible Allana Bykes, a neurodiversity coach and the co-founder of Candor Diversity Group. Allana shares her personal journey navigating ADHD alongside the hormonal changes that come with menopause. We talk about how estrogen supports ADHD symptoms, why medication doesn't always seem to work during the different phases of your cycle, and how to give yourself permission to rest and ask for support. If you've ever felt like your brain and body are at odds, this one is for you. Welcome back. I am so excited that you have joined me again in the Aligned Womb, Aligned You podcast. I'm Kate Nagai, and I am your host and womb guide on this journey. I'm here to help you to lean into the language of your menstrual cycle so that you can align yourself and awaken and activate to your womb wisdom to live the most inspired life. I am so excited to jump into this episode and to dive into today's topic. So let's get started. Hi, Allana. Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to have you here. This has been a little bit of a time coming. I've been probing you for a bit to come on here, so I'm so excited that you finally said yes.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited, Kate.
Well, and today we're going to dive into something that's your specialty, which, I can honestly say I don't know a lot of people working in this field or this area. And so I'm really excited to hear your take, your research, and your experience with it, which is the intersection of ADHD, estrogen, and menopause.
Yeah, I work in the neurodiversity space doing neurodiversity education. And then I got to this place in my own journey and my own life where my body started saying, hey, we're starting to make changes. And it pushed me into learning about like the menopause journey, the whole realm of it. And the more I learned about menopause and perimenopause, the more I realized that I could find people who could talk about that. I could find people like to support me. And then I could find people who could talk about ADHD, but I couldn't find anybody who could talk about the two pieces together. And the more I learned about both areas, the more I realized that there are really important pieces of overlap that like none of my practitioners could adequately support me in either. And so I was having to teach them what I needed. Um, and the more I talked to people about it, the more I realized there's so many women in this phase of life who are also dealing with neurodiversity. And I would sprinkle just a couple pieces of information about how the two pieces interact. And it was like I dropped a bomb on them. They had no idea the two things kind of butted heads, and that the experience of ADHD and the experience of perimenopause, they don't work together very well. And it's really, I mean, even now, when I go looking for data and information, it's very siloed. And it's frustrating. It's disappointing. So this is my area of hyper focus.
Well, and to be honest, it's kind of two fields that really haven't had a lot of attention until the recent years, right? Like women's health is just now starting to pique the ears of physicians and scientists and research. And I don't think ADHD has been the forefront either. I could be wrong on that, but
No. So, I mean, when we talk about ADHD, I think it's really important to know that the diagnosis has changed its name a few times, but it's not an old diagnosis. It's like its symptom presentation in the medical model is uh, 60, 70 years old. It's not a long standing diagnosis. And for the longest time, it was a boy's diagnosis.
Mhm.
They used to think that boys outgrew their ADHD. And now what we've discovered is that they don't outgrow their ADHD, they marry. They get married, and their wives take on a lot of the labor that manages their symptoms. Um, the female presentation for ADHD wasn't even in the diagnostic, like, wasn't even something you could diagnose. It was added in the DSM in 2000.
Mhm.
So, of course, there's all these women who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s who are suddenly getting diagnosed because the information has finally permeated out. But they're outside of the institutions where they would have been noticed. Once you're out of school, nobody's noticing it for you. It's your job to do it. And then the other thing that's happening is that they're starting to get into this perimenopause phase of their life where their hormones are starting to change and the hormones are no longer supporting their ADHD symptoms the way it was before. And so it's like two big things kind of erupting at the same time.
Mhm. Okay, I want to back up a minute there because you said something that tweaked my interest a little bit about how male ADHD it moves into this marriage where the spouse takes on a lot of the caretaking here. Can we expand on that? Because I know there's people that are going to be listening to this podcast and they're going to be experiencing their own ADHD, but then there's going to be a whole handful of women out there that are going to be like, I'm in my 40s, I'm in perimenopause, I feel like I'm losing my mind, but it's because of this hyper responsibility that they've taken on, generally at a younger age when they met their partners, and they said yes to all of it. And then now in their 40s, they're like, wait a minute, this isn't working for me anymore.
So I want to be careful here. And I want to make sure that we're not painting everyone with the same brush. But a lot of the characteristics, a lot of the dysfunction of ADHD, um, a lot of the support for ADHD shows up as an executive assistant.
Mm,
So the remembering to book appointments, the remembering to show up somewhere, the paying the bill on time, the managing um, impulse control around spending, so budgeting and staying on top of those things. Um, where did I put this? The not being able to find things, like the working memory and the executive function tasks are often women's work,
mhm,
traditionally. And um, and so a lot of these pieces, um, the way it shows up, a lot of that, those tasks were things that were managed by a parent. And then you grow up and you move out, and either you don't manage those things at all, and then eventually you partner up with somebody else. And um, we tend to find partners who fill in the gaps.
mhm,
Consciously or unconsciously, we tend to choose people who fill in our gaps. And so if you really struggle to, um, if you really struggle with like working memory, if you really struggle with executive function tasks, you pick a partner who is really good at those things. And you might not even know that you're doing it, right?
mhm,
They just, that's the thing they're good at. You kind of those tasks get offloaded there. And then the things that they're not good at, you take them on. That's part of a good partnership. But if you don't, like, that's how that we're starting to understand that that's how we thought it, we grew out of it. And we're
mhm.
starting to understand that you don't actually outgrow it. You find support
Yeah.
as you move through life.
And just to add another layer on with what you're saying here, for women who have a partner who have this ADHD tendency or diagnosis, it's really important for women to know, every woman to know, that when we're in our mid 20s, around that 25, DHEA is one of our hormones and it
peaks at 25, and it's our stress buffer. It is the thing that gives us this resiliency to think that, yeah, we can say yes to all these things, but it naturally begins to decline. And so a lot of times in our 20s, like we fall in love with the person, but then when by the time we hit our 40s and we're going through our own hormonal shifts and this fountain of youth hormone, as one of my teachers calls it, starts to dissipate, that's where the questioning comes in of, but I don't want to do this anymore. Like, why am I the one that's always tasked with this? And if you didn't understand why you came into that agreement in your 20s, like the DHEA piece is so, for me at least, it's been so fundamental to learn about, of being like, I was okay with this 10 years ago. Why am I not okay with it now? And it's because our hormone shifts, and a lot of those hormones that made us say yes to a lot of things, they also start to go down. So,
Absolutely. And when we talk about ADHD in women, um, most of us, like I did, my doctors never told me this. I found it when I hyper focused on my own diagnosis and tried to figure out how to support myself, and then started doing this work. Um, I didn't know how much the estrogen in my body and my brain was supporting my ADHD, just how much my own hormones were almost kind of medicating my own ADHD. And so, estrogen does so much for our like our working memory. It does a lot to support our focus. Um, it and so there's so many different symptoms within an ADHD diagnosis and presentation that, you might find you're really okay for the first, like for the parts of your cycle where your AD or where your estrogen is higher. And then as your estrogen wanes, towards the end of your cycle, your symptom profile is so much more aggressive or so much more present. And like, I remember thinking I was crazy. I remember thinking I was crazy. How come I work so well and I function so well last week, and this week I'm falling apart? I can't remember where my keys are. I can't remember where my phone is. I don't even know. Like, I'd find my keys in the weirdest places. And it wasn't until I understood the relationship of estrogen and my ADHD that I started to understand that, like, even my meds weren't working enough.
mhm.
Um, in certain phase of my cycle. And I had to go teach my doctor that.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy that, like, I think this is such an essential element of that's what's missing right now in everyday, I don't even want to call it women's health, but in educating women on their bodies, is we do this sex education, we do period prep, but we don't really talk about the power behind these hormones and the impact they have on our bodies, and understanding that they're not there every day. They're
Yeah,
there for a time and then they get a break. And on that break, you have a different hormone that picks up a different job. And it totally it impacts people so differently. And when it comes to additional diagnoses, that layers even more impact on, whether that be your ADHD, whether that be PMDD, whether it be fibroids, endometrial, like all of these diagnoses, they are always in this intrinsic dance with a hormone. And it's a game changer, I think, when we can understand the impact each hormone has and how we can utilize it to be our superpowers, and then also how we can support when we don't have it.
right. So you mentioned PMDD. That's that's a challenging thing to get a diagnosis for already. But
Mhm.
in the AD, it is a highly co-occurring condition with ADHD,
Really?
highly co-occurring. So the a lot of the characteristics of ADHD are similar to characteristics or have like correlations to pieces of PMDD. And so, emotional regulation can be a symptom in ADHD that a lot of people struggle with. But then PMDD is also one of the symptoms of it is really intense emotion, right?
Mhm.
Lots of swinging.
Yeah.
So, and then you add in the hormones, and it just is chaos. It feels like chaos.
Yeah, and well, and the thing is like with PMDD in particular, that isn't that we are depressed or that we are suicidal or that we're having these extreme mood disorders every day of the month. One of the key indicators that you might be experiencing PMDD is that it's impacted by that hormonal shift that happens post ovulation. So, for the last 2 weeks of your cycle, when estrogen's dropped and progesterone's the primary, that's when those intense emotions, mood elements kick in, right? And so, like you're saying right now with ADHD, very similar that it's that shift that all of a sudden you notice that, hey, why aren't my meds feeling the same as what they normally do, right?
Yeah, but then if you take that like that emotional presentation and you add on top of that that your executive function isn't working as well,
Mm.
because like so you already struggle with that the first 2 weeks of your cycle, but now you don't have the estrogen, your meds aren't working as well. So you like your symptoms of ADHD are heightened in those last
Mm.
2 weeks. And you add that on top of PMDD, I just want to hold those women. I just
Yeah.
want to hug them. It's so difficult. And I remember when I look back on my 20s, I remember thinking I could overcome it. And as I got older, as I got further into my 30s, as life became more complicated, I didn't have as much bandwidth to overcome and compensate for um, the symptoms of like those last 2 weeks like I
Hmm.
used to. And I think that some of that's the DHA. I think some of that is also the instability of perimenopause.
Well, and it's also how life shifts. Your life when you are in your 19, early 20s to when you're 35 is very different. All of a sudden, you potentially have mortgage payments, car loans, you have, you're thinking about retirement funds, you have all this other things like your day-to-day to-do list is way different than am I going to go backpacking next month or do I wait till next year to go to Thailand, right? Like it's
Right.
very, and I don't mean to minimize it, but that was me, right? Like it was like, where should I travel this year versus being like, okay, I have 3 kids. I've
Hmm.
got a mortgage. I have a dog who just got injured and now I got to care for that thing because now it's another kid in my life. And like you have all this more layered responsibility and if you're in a relationship, like you've already talked about, often women carry the mental load. We take
Hmm.
on the day-to-day tasks. And whether that be because men's brains are just not wired to care as much about those things, or whether it's we've just been really trained that I think modern life has really shifted us as women to live in day-to-day anxiety of like if this doesn't get tended to, it's the whole world's gonna blow up, right? And it's one thing I can really appreciate sometimes with my husband because he's like, "What's the big deal if we don't worry about it today?" And it's like, I guess you got a point, but in my mind, it feels like these 10 things can potentially go wrong if we don't think about this right now.
And I think that's just it, is that a lot of the way that our social conditioning, I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what phrase to use, our social conditioning has us women trained to be thinking 10 steps out.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is, who's going to have to pick up the consequences of those 10 steps?
You just nailed or put the hammer on the nail there. Like it's so true. Because when shit goes south, my husband's not worrying about it. It's me worrying about it.
Um, I used to do work where I had a certain amount of like responding to crises. Not the work I do anymore. The work I used to do was a lot of responding to crisis. Whenever it happens, being ready to go. And so to this day, I'm still really good at that kind of thinking. I need so much more recovery time than I used to. But now that I know how my brain works and what my brain needs, I understand that the reason that I'm so good at those things is because I have a finely tuned pattern recognition like
Mm,
skill.
yep.
And responding to a crisis is full of adrenaline, it's full
Hmm.
of dopamine, it's full of norepinephrine, it's full of all these rewarding brain chemicals. And so my brain just gets flooded with all the stuff that, as someone who lives with ADHD, my brain is always low on. I never have enough of those. And so crisis management stuff, like crisis for me and problem solving, uh, who needs drugs? That's the good stuff. That makes my brain so happy. And so that 10 step ahead thinking for me
Yeah.
is that's where all the fun stuff is. That's where all the good stuff is. But
So
you want
with
me to like, if you want me to like, you know, do the monotonous, repetitive task every day, that's torture. I would rather have my teeth pulled without anesthetic.
Gotcha. So with ADHD, is there a link somehow to reduced levels or yeah, reduced levels, let's call it reduced levels to dopamine, to serotonin, to those neurotransmitters, or like do we know if there's a connection between the two?
Yeah. Um, so ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a terrible name. It's it's the name we have. But ADHD is more of a attention dysregulation issue. So it's um, some people they have too much dopamine in their brain, and some people they have not enough dopamine in their brain. And so either way, and the way our nervous system and our brains are built, you really want to live in the sweet spot of
Mhm.
just enough dopamine all the time, just enough. And so and there's other neurotransmitters that go into it, but dopamine's an easy one to focus on. And so, depending on how your ADHD presents, whether you have an inattentive presentation or a hyperactivity presentation or a combination, that helps you know whether you have too much dopamine all the time or whether you have too little all the time. And so, when people get treated for ADHD, often what they're being treated with is medications that create the precursors for neurotransmitters in your body. So you add more of the precursors to your system so you can metabolize it into enough dopamine in your brain. And that's what helps us focus. It helps us with the memory. It helps us be calm enough to sit at a desk or it. And so one of the reasons why there's so many different ways to treat it is because A, all brains are different, and B, some people have too much and some people have not enough. Um, and so it really is a condition of not enough
Hmm.
of the neurotransmitters that are part of our brain's reward system.
And for anyone listening, these neurotransmitters all are in relationship with our hormones as well. We won't get into that because that's a whole nother
That's
conversation.
a whole nother
But
conversation.
like these things, and this is what I find so interesting and fascinating about hormones, is that there is not any system in our body that isn't reliant on a relationship with hormones. I don't want to say that they're reliant on hormones. It's like they have a relationship. Every system in our body has some kind of relationship with it. Every cell in our body has receptors for estrogen and progesterone, right? And so you cannot function without the presentation of these two, which is why so many women, I think, struggle so much when we hit perimenopause. Because, first of all, we didn't know in our earlier years what was happening with these hormones. We were just kind of riding the wave. And then all of a sudden, life happens, life impacts our health and wellness. Those impacts on those systems that are being impacted, therefore, then impact our hormones. Our hormones are also decreasing because of age. So that therefore impacts the system. Like it's like this two-way superhighway that's happening that can be chaotic. And so, yeah, they're not independent.
No, and that's the piece that like I didn't understand for the longest time after my diagnosis, because I was taking my medications and I thought I was doing great, and then I would have a week or 10 days or 2 weeks where like I would be doubting. I'd be, I normally take my meds at 7 or 8 in the morning. I'd be at 11 o'clock in the morning going, did I take them this morning? Did I forget?
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I understood how important estrogen was to supporting my symptoms, but also to the metabolizing of my medications into into dopamine and the neurotransmitters I need to support my symptoms. And that's when I started to understand that like two things were happening at the same time. My brain was didn't have enough hormones and therefore didn't have enough dopamine by itself. And then I was taking my medication and my medication didn't have enough hormones and to make the neurotransmitters that the medication is supposed to make. And once I understood that, it it blew my mind, and it caused me to start doing some research. And there isn't good research on the cyclical presentation of ADHD and medicating that in women. I think something that made me so angry when I learned it. The first gender study about ADHD that like separated women out was published in 2017. Like, no wonder we're out here figuring out these two, like how to manage this in our bodies by ourselves and having to educate our practitioners on it. If the research is in elementary school. If it was a child, it would be in elementary school. Like it is, we're underserved in terms of the research and the data. And I think a lot of us are just trying to figure it out on our own.
Well, I think under research, but I think another big element that's missing is that we are trying to medically, or no, not medically, sorry, let me rewrite that, to pharmaceutically tend to these disorders when the pharmaceuticals have not been tested on women or tested on a true sample of the cycle, right? Like I heard this once and I thought it was brilliant, and I can understand why it's so bloody expensive. But if we are saying that this is safe to use, then we really should be putting the time and effort into doing it properly, in my opinion, because I'm a perfectionist. But the idea is that if we really want to see how medication affected women, especially when we're asking them to take it repetitively, not like just a symptomology of like you have a headache, take an Advil, and we don't have to worry about it for 2 more months. Like if we're asking someone to take this daily and take it for a duration of time, we really should be testing how medication lands right after a period. So when all hormones are low, we should
Mhm.
also be testing it at close to ovulation when estrogen and our androgens are high, and then testing it again late luteal when estrogen is low and progesterone is high. Like we really need to have at least like a three-part trial or three-part study to see how it's actually affecting all different realms. We want to see the full cycle, and we don't have that. I don't think there's any medication out there that's ever been tested for all three phases.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly the way it is. I know I've been like I built a plan with my practitioner for how we adjust my dosage throughout my cycle to manage my symptoms. But you hit a couple things there. For someone with ADHD, if you're being prescribed medication to support that, realistically, you will likely be on that or some other medication at least until you retire,
Hmm.
because then you're not in the workforce and you don't have to be super focused. But for some people, they need it just for their everyday functionality. And it's something that they're going to be on for the rest of their lives. And we're telling women to take this medication, and we've never really actually studied it on a woman's body. And I think it does a tremendous disservice to us, um, because a lot of the side effects of this medication are things like elevated anxiety, elevated depression symptoms. And like it just, there's,
Well, and
it's
those
not.
two things, elevated depression and anxiety, those play into PMDD, right? And so, like, if we're looking at it that way, we could be layering on more conditions or creating an environment for those conditions or those genetics to turn on because we haven't tested this on a woman's cycle properly.
Right. And if you're like, if you as the individual aren't resourced enough to be able to do a deep dive into ADHD, into your hormones, into your system, if you don't have the resources or the capacity to listen to your podcast, Kate, or to spend a whole bunch of time reading a whole bunch of books and finding the studies and reading them, then you aren't going to have the tools you need to go and teach your doctor how to adequately prescribe you. And so all of a sudden, you're a few years into your diagnosis and you're on an ADHD medication, you're on an antidepressant or an anxiety like you can end up on a ton of medications trying to manage something that is a cyclical issue because you don't know and none of the people who are treating you know.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm managing mine, but I know that I'm doing it at a very like it's a base level because we don't have a deep wealth of knowledge of how to manage these how to manage these co-occurring conditions because, and not even conditions, they're just states of being. That I am someone who has a cycle, that's not a condition, that's just that's a state of being. But we don't know. We're just trying to figure it out. And I'm lucky that this is an area that I'm so interested and I've spent a ton of time learning about it. But I talk to so many women and I sprinkle one or two or three little tidbits of information and they've never been exposed to it about how to better support their ADHD in conjunction with their cycle. And they have no idea. Nobody is talking to them about it. And I just think that it's so cruel that people are living with this brain type and this body type. And there's so little information about the two together and how to thrive. Like we should be allowed to thrive as someone who has a cycle and has a brain that works the way that mine does or that an ADHD brain works. We shouldn't have to, it shouldn't have to be as hard as it is.
Agreed. Now, you've said something a few times, and I think just for listeners, for a clarification, because I'm sure there's going to be people listening to this going, do I have it? I don't know. I've never been diagnosed, or I've never heard this term. Can we talk a little bit about executive function? Because you've said it multiple times that estrogen, like you're able to, thrive here, but in progesterone, this is a struggle. So can we talk a little bit about what the executive function is and what you're referring to? And then maybe we can weave that into talking about some skills or tools that we can use when we are in that second half of the cycle, when we feel like we have no resources for this.
Okay. So executive function is things like being able to organize your day. So I need to get out of bed at this time. I need this much time to brush my teeth, this much time to wash my face, this much time to do my hair, this much time to do my makeup, this much time to pick an outfit, get dressed, make breakfast, make my lunch, take the dog for a walk, get in the car, drive to work. Oh, it's construction season, so I actually need this much time. I need a buffer. Like that is all executive function. And then you show up at work and you have to organize your day and do all the tasks of your job. And it depends on what your job is. Some jobs don't have a lot of executive function because you just take whatever comes at you and process it and move forward. Other jobs require you to be really strategic. Executive function speaks to what it takes to organize your day, your week, your life. It's remembering to call your doctor because you need to book an appointment. It's remembering to, you have to pick the kids up early today because one of them has a dentist appointment. It's remembering to write a check for the daycare. It's remembering and then executing the things. So I'm really good at remembering. I will wake up at 3:00 in the morning with like the 3 things that I forgot to do during the day and still not execute them. It's all the little tasks that it takes to operate your life. So the dysfunction of that is not being able to do it, not being able to organize it. And executive function shows up in a lot of different ways, but it's the organizing of your life. And if you're a parent, it's the organizing of your life and your kids' lives and your home.
Yeah. We call it the family business.
Yeah. Yeah.
A whole nother job. So yeah, a whole nother task. And so estrogen, why is it easier to move through and have strong executive function in an estrogenic state? So the first half of our
So
cycle.
so estrogen helps to support memory,
Mhm.
working memory, because your like longer term memory and your working memory are two different things. Working memory is the ability to remember a phone number that somebody just read out to you. It's the ability to remember why you walked into this room. Why did I go downstairs? That's your working memory. That's the short term functional in the moment memory. Um, Estrogen supports your ability to focus, so to stay on track, or also to bounce from things, right? So if you get pulled away by a question, to be able to come right back to what you were working on. Estrogen supports, so if we focus on those two pieces right there, if estrogen supports your working memory and your ability to focus, your executive function works better when you can remember things, both short term and long term, and when you can stay focused, right? So, hey, today I need to make this call and I need to drop that in the mail and I need to book this appointment, right? I need to do those three things at some point today. Estrogen is supporting your focus and your working memory. Your executive function works better because you've got the capacity, you've got the capacity throughout the day to retain those couple tasks that you need to get done at some point, whenever. But if you've implemented strategies, you also need the working memory and the focus to follow through on those strategies to support yourself. So for me, I don't keep those things in my head anymore. I can't trust my brain to hold on to, I need to call the doctor, I need to book a car appointment, I need to do this and that. Those all go into my calendar,
Mhm.
which has its own flaws, but we're making progress.
Well, and
um,
estrogen is also gives you motivation, right? It is
right?
a hormone that really does marinate the cognitive part of our brain, of our system, right? It increases cognition, it increases our vocabulary. We have way more language skills with estrogen. Like it's
Really?
crazy. Yes, they say that the part of our brain that's made for language, it is primed for estrogen. And so if you want to pick a fight or you want to ask for a raise, do it in the first half of your cycle because you have way more vocabulary.
Ah,
Yeah.
that's wild.
Yeah. Just primes a different part of our brain. And then when we move into progesterone, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's the opposite, but it works differently in our body. Progesterone is really about tending to our nervous system, which I don't have ADHD, but I'm guessing that nervous system regulation isn't something that you cozy up to a lot of the times. Like it's not like it's not like you're like, I want to feel relaxed and calm. It's you're still really active, if I'm correct. I could be wrong.
Yeah. So one of the things about ADHD specifically that we don't fully I mean, we don't fully understand anything about ADHD, let's be honest. But one of the things that we don't have a really great grasp on yet is what rest looks like for someone with ADHD. So a lot of people who live with it will talk about not being able to sit still in the silence
Hmm.
by themselves. And that's something that a lot of people have to learn. But even if you don't have ADHD, that's something a lot of people have to learn how to do. But for someone with ADHD, often what happens is that with some types of presentations, often what happens is you actually need enough stimulation on parts of your brain to be able to focus in one area. So lots of people that I talk to about this sort of stuff will say things like, oh yeah, I work so much better with music in my ears, I can study so much better listening to music, or having a movie that I've watched a million times in the background. I don't have to pay attention to it, but it's there and it's familiar and it's predictable. And so it's occupying a piece of their brain. And rest for some people can be like that too, where they need a white noise machine, they need a fan running, they need just enough predictable stimulation that it's not pulling their attention away, it's actually just activating a part of their nervous system. And because it's predictable, it's safe. So it helps your nervous system be in a more restful state. And I find that really fascinating, that for some neurotypes, some types of brains, you actually need a high enough level of stimulation in order to be able to relax, because it's so counterintuitive to what we think about as rest.
Yeah. Well, and I heard somewhere that for the male nervous system to regulate and to maintain, or to be tended to, I guess would be a better way to put it, um, they require dopamine hits, where actually the female nervous system requires oxytocin. And
Hmm.
so oxytocin, and in the sense of our nervous system, it's not just perhaps cuddling or sex, because a lot of us don't want either of those in our luteal phase. We want space and no touch, but it comes in a sense of community. It comes in, knowing that you have someone to rely on. It's about having co-regulation, right? Of being in part of something. And I think for a lot of women, we, especially in modern day society, we struggle with that element of how to receive oxytocin that way, because we don't have community, or we don't have people that we can rely on, or we feel like we have to go at it alone, or we've really been trained to be codependent. And codependent doesn't mean that you're dependent on someone else. It means that you are stuck in this wheel of believing that if you don't do everything, everyone's going to suffer. So you take on way more, right? I think we have a misconception of what codependency is. And
Mhm.
so oxytocin, I'm really curious, because it plays into, if progesterone is tending to our nervous system and oxytocin is what helps us regulate our nervous system as females, that presentation alone can feel pretty awful for some women in their second half of their cycle, even when not layering ADHD on there. ADHD, yeah, I said that right. I
Yeah.
put all the letters in there. There's a lot of letters in there.
There is. Um, we don't know a lot about how oxytocin fits into the ADHD presentation. But the piece you touched on there about community and the sort of the conditioning to do everything, to go it alone, I think is a really, I feel like that's a whole other conversation. How we're not meant to live the way we're living.
Mhm.
Um, when when we look at ADHD, like historically, when we look at the evolutionary purpose of ADHD, there's some really cool pieces to it. One of the pattern recognition piece of ADHD, historically would have been really helpful for noticing, a source of food that maybe we wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Or, with ADHD, you can have a delayed circadian rhythm. So a lot of people with ADHD struggle to go to bed at the regular social norm time of like the school workplace structure, which means they struggle to get up and be functional at the same on that same schedule. But at an evolutionary standpoint, when we were more nomadic, when we were more community based, somebody who had a delayed circadian rhythm would have been really supportive for being on night shift for the
Yeah.
village. The executive function piece might not have been a problem if you had other people in community who were really good at the repetitive, consistent tasks. In fact, there are other neurodiversities that want a lot of rigidity in their day to day. Those folks would have been great at the repetitive, routine tasks. Whereas the less predictable stuff, where you're constantly chasing those neurotransmitters, you're always looking for a little hit, those would have been great for like a more hunter-gatherer style of existing. Being able to notice that there's something over in the bush over there just moved when nobody else noticed that bush over there moving, like that would have been very helpful historically. But now we live in this very, the way we live now is not conducive to an ADHD neurotype at
Or
all.
for women.
No.
I'm going to just say for women, the way we've structured society is to benefit the male hormonal system. It is completely layered with the patriarchy determining what will be most efficient for men, not for women. If we were to take women's bodies into mind and we started to live it cyclically and started to honor a different rhythm that matched a 28, 30-day rhythm, that would look very different. And I think like what you just touched on with how ADHD had a place, right? Like rather than seeing it as a weakness or seeing it as a condition, it was like, we have this group of people to help us out this way, right? We have a team and we have this team and we have that team. Like everyone has some kind of gift to offer. And when you look at it that way, you can see how that's layered in with women's health as well. That as women, we are four different versions and we cycle through these four different versions each month. And each version of us has a special gift to give and an Achilles heel. But we focus so much on the Achilles heel that we miss the opportunity, right? And this is why so many women hate the week before their period, because they feel like they're just failing at everything or that they're just incredibly grouchy. The inner critic comes in so strongly, but it's because we are still trying to be the person we were 2 weeks ago and missing the opportunity of being different here in this moment and providing a different skill set. And I think with ADHD women, like how you just layered it of that we could be these helpers in so many different ways if we were given the space to actually honor those as gifts versus seeing them as Achilles heels all the time.
It wasn't until I found you, Kate, that I actually started leaning into the 4 different me's.
I love it.
I had figured out that there were 2 me's,
Mm-hmm.
one on low dose and one on high dose, trying to like overcome and manage my ADHD. And then I found you right around the same time I was starting to learn about the relationship of estrogen and my ADHD
Mm-hmm.
at the same time as I was starting to experience perimenopause. Boy, was this fun. And when I found you and I found that I started finding that information, I was still at a place in my life where I didn't have as much autonomy over my day-to-day activities and production value as I do now. And so I remember learning these things against a backdrop of I need to show up as the same person every day, Monday through Friday, predictably, consistently, and I need to grind out the same amount every day. And there's a certain amount of some of the DHA changing in my brain, some
Yeah.
of the hitting a certain phase of my life where I've just run out of things. But learning to be a different version of myself every week, and being okay with that, is it's a work in progress, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also been so powerful, finding the permission to ebb and flow with my cycle and my hormones, but also with the way my brain works. One of the gifts of ADHD is that you can accomplish, when I get into a hyper focus or when I get into a deadline, I can get so much work done in such a short period of time. And now I'm learning to give myself the permission of, I crushed it this day. I produced an entire week's worth of work in an afternoon. And that means tomorrow and the day after are guilt-free rest days, because it's not my job to produce at that level every day, all the time. And I lived that way for a long time. And that's a really common experience for folks with ADHD. We're so used to not being enough. There's a lot of dialogue around where we're failing, where we're disordered. And finding a path to understand and ebb and flow with our capacity is really freeing, but also there's so much power once you figure it out.
Yeah. I love that. That was really powerful. So, progesterone, second half of the cycle. What would be your top tip or two on women that are struggling with ADHD during this transition time when estrogen drops and progesterone kind of takes over? What would you say to help them find ease through this transition? Which I'm just going to say right now that our PMS week, the week after our period or before our period, that is really representative of perimenopause. If we look at the life cycle, because we are cycles within cycles, and so our menstrual cycle really does overlap on what the life cycle looks like. So if you're struggling in your luteal phase the week before your period and you're struggling in perimenopause, there are so many similarities here. And so how we tend to ourselves on that smaller cycle can really be the same kind of wisdom that we apply to that bigger life cycle of perimenopause.
So I would start with reframing, like a mental shift of understanding for the purpose of gentleness and kindness, like coming from a place of gentleness and kindness with yourself. And I don't say that for like an excuse. I didn't get any work done this week because I'm in the last week of my cycle. That's not what I'm saying. But when the struggle is more intense, when the symptoms are more intense, if you're coming at it from a place of, oof, my body has changed, I'm this person this week, not beating yourself up would be the first step. Because one of the hardest pieces of ADHD is how much negative feedback we get, both like verbally and unconscious, from the people around us and from ourselves. So reframing to a place of gentleness, kindness, and understanding is the first piece. And that alone can make such a big difference. If you're not beating up on yourself, it can be a lot easier to get through. The other piece I would say is finding support. And support looks different for everybody. So that could be, support looks different for everybody. That might mean that you don't stack as much of the executive function into that week. You know, there's always calls that need to be made and appointments that need to be booked, but is this the week that you really have to be doing that stuff, or can it wait till next week when you're starting to function better? And in that case, push it off or push it forwards, whichever way. But stacking difficult tasks, things that are hard for you, that you procrastinate, you put off for weeks and weeks and weeks. Stacking those things in the first few weeks of, or the first week or two of your cycle when your estrogen is higher, and then giving yourself a gentler, it's what you talk about, Kate. It's just through the lens of ADHD, being so much gentler with yourself and reducing your cognitive load, reducing how many big focus things you need to do, how much memory work you need to do. where you can. And look, there's things that are out of our control. We have to show up in places, but the things that you can control, learning to flow with your symptoms, um, and gentleness and asking for help. I think so many of us are afraid to ask for help and count on people. And yeah, not everybody shows up the way we need you to, but community comes from asking for help and then also showing up for other people. And I think as women, I don't know about all women, but I know for me, I'm really good at showing up to be the helper. I really struggle to be helped.
Well, and I think all women face that, but I almost wonder if ADHD women face that more in the sense that you've always been rewarded for your output. And
Yeah.
so if you've always been somebody who has been required, or not required, but seen as like 110% in, and you say, I need to step back, that can feel really hard. Like I can feel that. And yeah, it's hard to step back and say, I can't be everything to everyone today. And that's okay when you've only been praised, rewarded, and told to keep doing what you're doing, which is actually wearing you out.
Well, and the other side of it is all the things that you haven't been good at, haven't been able to do. If you've lived, with a narrative in your own self and from other people of all the things that you're failing at, the vulnerability that's necessary to ask for help can really push a lot of nervous system buttons. Like that can really activate your nervous system. And so it's a skill that needs to be practiced. It's something to work on. But going back to the evolutionary purpose of ADHD, there are things that you're so gifted at, and the village needs those things, and other people in the village have the other pieces that they're good at, and everybody needs the thing that they're good at and needs to do it. And the whole village needs that for the whole village to thrive. And learning to ask for help, to support yourself, to ask for accommodation, to provide yourself with your own accommodation is so supportive. And so it falls into the hormonal pattern of, I don't have all the skills this week. I'm going to be gentle with myself. I'm going to be kind. I'm going to push this off to next week because that needs a lot of function from me. And I'm going to do these things that are gentle to myself. And so it looks different for everybody. For some people, it's this week, we're doing a lot of takeout because I don't have the energy to do it. And for some people, it's, I don't want to be touched at all. I don't want to be around my family. I don't want to do the things this week. Like there isn't one answer for everybody. And so,
But there's permission
yeah.
to be
And
what you need
so
to be.
the understanding and therefore the kindness and the gentleness and like the benefit of the doubt. My gosh, if women in general and women with ADHD could exist in a space of the benefit of the doubt that you are actually doing your best, you're
Yeah.
probably doing more than your best. If we could live in that space, oh my gosh, I think so many of us would be so much happier, so
Mm-hmm.
much more regulated.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, we don't have to be everything to everyone and not be willing to receive.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I know we're at time here, but I have one question that I think is an important question. So hopefully I'm not going to keep you too long. But
Okay.
quick question is, now you mentioned about figuring out that your meds were not working for you the same in the second half of your cycle and having that conversation with your physician. Is this something that you would recommend women who have been diagnosed with ADHD or being medicated for it, that if they're noticing that same pattern, to openly have that conversation with their physicians? And like, how can women navigate that conversation of like, is there something different we can do for the second half of my cycle that is different than what we're doing for the first half because it's not working?
Um, So I want to be really careful here.
Hmm.
This is absolutely a conversation to have with your doctor. And it really depends on what category and class of medications you're on, because some of them, they work differently. Um, and some of the medications that you take for ADHD, you can change them from day to day, and others have a really long lag period to build up enough in the body and brain. And so those ones, you can't necessarily change your dosage as easily. Um, and on top of that, we do not have a body of research to explain and justify it. We have indicators and we sort of think, but we don't know the way we know about other conditions or other solutions. So I want to be really clear there.
This
Um,
is not medical advice, everybody. This
this
is
is
just like
not medical advice,
you want to
but
have this conversation with your doctor. Here's some things to think about.
because estrogen impacts your symptoms so much and impacts the way your medication works in your brain, increasing the dose of your medication when your estrogen is low can be supportive for some people. So for me, I just go up one dosage step on my medication for the last 2 weeks of my cycle. And it doesn't fix everything. I am still less, like, I still am a lot more emotionally dysregulated that last 2 weeks of my cycle. I still am more anxious. I'm more likely to be in a dark headspace. Um, but it is easier in other respects because I have better support for my focus. I have better support for my memory. So it's not perfect, but it's better than what I was doing before, which was nothing. One of the other things that I've been doing, which seems to be helping, is following some of the dietary, like the cyclical dietary changes. And so making sure that I'm doing as much as I can with my diet to support my hormones as I cycle through. But changing my med dosage has been, for me, has been better than not doing it.
Okay, perfect. And, yes, food is so important. Gut health is important, right? And food affects our gut health. Our gut is where a lot of these neurotransmitters are created and housed. So as much as they affect the brain, they it starts in the gut.
Yeah.
So the food we eat, the way we tend to our gut can have a huge impact on those aspects. I'm not saying that it's going to cure, but it does help with the production and maintenance of neurotransmitters.
Yeah. And one of the biggest disservices I think that we get is it's never really well communicated to us some of the dietary changes that can be supportive for ADHD.
Hmm.
And if you're always like, I didn't understand for a long time that a lot of the decisions that I make in a day on an unconscious level, I'm negotiating whether that task is worth the dopamine that I will have to expend to do the task and if I will get enough back. And once I started understanding the why of certain things that support my brain and my functionality, all of a sudden that equation changed and it made, oh, now it makes sense for me to extend that energy, that dopamine, in order to do the thing that I don't want to do. I don't
Hmm.
want to do that. But now I understand the relationship enough and I know what the reward is. And so I can convince myself to do the work because the reward makes the rest of my day better. And I think a tremendous disservice is that we don't get that stuff explained to us. And so if you're constantly unconsciously negotiating the expenditure of dopamine until you understand the why, it's not worth it.
Yeah. Well, it's so true with nutrition. Nutrition has been so, it's been taught to us always with this lens of diet, right? There's such a diet element intertwined into food that we all have this really, let's call it rough relationship with eating. And you're right, like to create a nutritious meal that's going to be supportive. A lot of times it's like, but it's easier to do that, or it's cheaper to do that. And it wasn't until I really understood the nutrition, the minerals, that why we want to eat a certain way, that I was willing to saute vegetables every morning for myself.
Yeah.
Old Kate in her 20s would have never ate vegetables for breakfast.
I really struggle with breakfast. I am not a breakfast girl. I have never been a breakfast girl. I'm not a morning girl, if we're being really honest. But um, I, you know, somewhere early on after my diagnosis with my medication, I was told to make sure I have protein with it. Okay, but I'm not a breakfast person. So the milk in my coffee, that's probably enough protein to go with my meds, right? I didn't understand the relationship until I started doing a deep dive into it. And now what I understand is that for the particular medication I was taking, I need all the amino acids that come from protein in my body for my medication to metabolize properly. And until I understood that, you could not convince me to get up and scramble a handful of eggs in the morning and choke them down. But now that I understand that, I have given myself permission to find shortcuts that I can tolerate to get over the hump so that my medication works, which means I have the executive function to make myself a high protein lunch and a high protein dinner and to do all the things. But I probably went through 5 or 6 years before I ever understood that relationship. And now I can be bothered. Now I can justify the expenditure and the energy to make the thing because I can see the relationship. But nobody ever slowed down long enough to explain the why. And I just think there's so many people out there living with this condition, struggling through it, who are doing their very best. They want to be thriving. They want to be living their best life. And they're missing so many of the whys. And once they figure that out, along with some permission and some understanding and some gentleness and some kindness and some benefit of the doubt, and it doesn't cure it. Nothing's going to cure it, but it's easier. It's easier.
Yep. Totally, 100%. Well, Allana, this has been an amazing conversation. And there's been we went to so many different angles. Like, let's be honest. We went there in this episode, and
we took a bit of an ADHD storytelling pathway. We went all over the place.
But I think there's so many important tidbits in here that are really going to be helpful for women navigating this, who have been struggling and don't know why and don't know what they can do about it, especially when potentially they've been told there's nothing they can do about it, right? And so thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and all the information that you provided for our listeners today. Are you excited about aligning to your cycle? If so, make sure that you subscribe to this podcast and like the episode if it really resonated with you. Until next time, remember, womb wisdom equals connection to self, which ultimately equals inspired living.